Welcome, everybody. I'm Sunil Amrith, Interim Director of the Mahindra Humanities Centre, and this is the second iteration of a somewhat impromptu Mahindra Centre series, Conversations on COVID-19 about pandemics past and present. I'm absolutely delighted to have Jill Lepore with me today to discuss a recent piece of hers in the New Yorker on plague literature, and more broadly to have a conversation about the situation that we are all in. Welcome, Jill, and thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much. It's fun to be with you.
Great. So, I mean, this came about as a result of us thinking, what the centre can do at this time when, of course, all programming is suspended. And there's been so much interest in the humanities at this time, and in particular, the study of the ways in which writers and in general, the cultural imagination has dealt with pandemics, which you've done so beautifully in this piece. You begin with Defoe and Journal of a Plague Year, and in some ways you see that as the archetype of plague literature. What are some of the features of that work that you think come to define the genre?
Well, Defoe did something really interesting in 1722. He wrote two books about the plague. One we would think of as nonfiction. It was called Due Preparations for the Plague. It's really an advice manual. Londoners were anticipating that the plague might be crossing the English Channel. It was already in France, had come from the Middle East, and so there was a lot of panic going on in anticipation of the travel of the plague. But then I think he realized that another genre of writing would do better in teaching people how to think about and anticipate and prepare for the arrival of the plague. So he wrote what we would call a novel, but this is before the kind of origins of the modern novel, or in the midst of that moment. The Journal of the Plague Year, it purports to be the journal of a Londoner in 1665, a terribly devastating year. 1 in 5 Londoners died that year of the plague. So he writes what we would consider to be fiction. I mean, much like the history of Robinson Crusoe, it disguises itself as something other than fiction. Because I think he understood that it would carry, in some ways, a deeper truth about the human condition than the kind of how-to, So what are the things about it that seem to me to be conventional? There's the sort of the parable of what happens when we are all closed up together and our fates are joined. When there, very quickly in Journal of the Plague Year, there's no escape. There's this moment early on when the rumors of the plague are coming, when some people manage to escape to their country houses, or the poor just leave for the country. I mean, and a lot of the poor have come from the country and they're going home to their country houses, meaning something very different. But by the time our narrator realizes that maybe he too would rather not remain in the city for the duration of the plague, the city's gates have been shut. And even if the city's gates weren't shut, there's not a horse to be found for purchase or hire. And I remember when I was reading that, it was a time when a friend who was in Brooklyn who was deciding whether or not to leave, and he was like, I can't rent a car. There's actually, it's quite disconcerting to read Journal of a Plague Year. The sequence of events is so almost overdetermined.
I was thinking about the news that's coming out of India, where they've had perhaps the most draconian lockdown of certainly any democratic country, and you have these stories of millions of migrant workers trying to get home and being turned back from the buses. And I was really sort of thinking about that when I read your piece and sort of quoting from the Defoe. So there is that sense of kind of enclosure. Are there other elements that you think then sort of endure in that genre that start with the Defoe?
Well, I read a pile of these books, and they, as I argue in this essay, they kind of sort into two pieces plot-wise. There's either the Journal of the Plague Year story, which is everybody's locked up and what's going to happen, or there's pretty much everybody's dead except for the stray band of survivors, and how do they get by? This is a kind of remnant story versus the quarantine story. So, but each of them, in any case, most fiction has the elements of the parable to it, but plague literature really is fundamentally a literature of parable. It almost has a kind of biblical quality to it, right? They really are parables even in this biblical sense. Like, we are reduced to the elemental confrontation of what it is to be human and what it is to lose your humanity. And your humanity is your ability to function above the level of an animal. But what happens in any plague is we feel ourselves slowly being reduced to the animal, like this sort of the sloughing off. I think I say in the piece that all plague literature is the story of a lobotomy. You're sort of watching your frontal cortex being lopped off until you're finally kind of down to your brainstem.
Right.
And it's horrifying that way. And it's as I say, also say in the piece, it's kind of a vile literature, because you watch that confrontation of, London is this lovely city at the start of Defoe. And by the end, people are crawling along the street like animals and scavenging the bones of the dead. I mean, we become animals. So the difference across the literature is really, what is the parable about? Like, everything is about the humanity reduced to the animal. And so the parable, like, it's the plague, but what is the plague standing in for?
At one point in the essay, you differentiate plague literature from the sort of genre of the outbreak novel, or perhaps more commonly outbreak movie. And what are the main differences there?
I think there's a dwelling on forms of resistance to the almost sort of inevitable descent. And we can, I think, watch with a real careful precision in the novel what is going on internally with our characters, where they find within themselves a capacity to express their humanity in spite of the circumstances in which they find themselves pressing them downward. All the stories are about them. And this is why I begin with Defoe, because they have a kind of Enlightenment quality. There's plenty of plague literature that's much more ancient, right? I mean, going back to Oedipus, or in many different traditions around the world. But in the European tradition, we begin with the Enlightenment, the sense that we're scaling a ladder from savagery to civilization. And in all the plague literature, we're falling down rung by rung. And in the literature, though, there's a capacity to sort of sit on a rung and look up and look down, and it's a kind of weird vantage that's happening, that I think is different than the purely forward plot driven cinematic approach.
You write that, and this sort of develops from what we've just talked about in terms of the stripping away of humanity to the animal, but you talk about the great dread being regress, and you talk about that when you talk about Jack London and the Scarlet Plague, a regression to a sort of primitive state. And I was really struck when I read that. I was struck by that in relation to some of our other anxieties now, particularly in relation to climate change. Because you quote London as writing, where 4 million, he's writing about San Francisco, where 4 million people disported themselves, the wild wolves roam today. And, just last week in The Guardian, there was a series of photographs of great world cities where the wildlife has come back. And in a way, those images have a different resonance. They're almost there to accompany these stories about how, the air is cleaner than it's ever been, and that maybe even our carbon emissions have been reduced over the last month. So I wonder, in a sense, if you could say a little bit more about that juxtaposition between progress and regress, and whether that maybe has a slightly different resonance for us now.
Oh, it absolutely does. I mean, I have to say candidly, the Jack London book I found loathsome in every way. I mean, I just could not stand it. It's kind of written from the height of American imperialism. It's participating in this ideology of a kind of great chain of racial evolution. I mean, it's got this social Darwinianism to it. It's especially invested in progressive forms of racism and segregation. I mean, the terror in the Jack London story, which is called The Scarlet Death, it's told from a future. It's one of these remnant tales. So we're looking 60 years after the plague has come, and we're hearing the story of the plague being recounted by a very old man to his grandsons. And one of the things he observes is that his grandsons, in addition to wearing animal skins and not knowing how to read and barely speaking English. They speak a kind of gibberish. They don't even fully have language, is that they have brown skin. Like that's the marker for London of, in London's figuring, right? The West has achieved this great ascent and triumph. And now through this disease, we've witnessed this decline, and even the white people are becoming darker, and the very wealthy barons at the pinnacle of industrial capitalism, they have been rendered like this the shocking tale in the middle is this woman who is the wife of this sort of like Andrew Carnegie kind of John Rockefeller kind of wife, who's basically married to her chauffeur and being raped by him daily. And we're asked to be disgusted by the topsy-turvy, the racial and economic topsy-turvy. And so for London, the whole parable is about that. It's about the fragility of our racial and economic hierarchies. And you're like, hey, it's not really our concern. Like, that's like exactly not the thing I'm worried about with the plague. So it does. Our stories are really different, and our stories about this moment will be really different. And what we're witnessing in terms of the way that this crisis amplifies inequity rather than turns everything upside down, that's actually the Enlightenment terror, right? That the hierarchy will be inverted, right? That the regression also involves an inversion of power. That's actually not what, right? People in power hold on to power. They seize and grab power. People who are powerless lose what little power and autonomy they have. Like, that's actually what happens.
Yeah, no, I found your sort of discussion of the London really sort of stimulating at this moment, not least because it is so abhorrent to us, and yet there are sort of elements of that which continue to sort of resonate in popular media coverage of the world falling apart at this moment, etc. And certainly the racialization element. One has seen plenty of that from the very beginning of this pandemic. Initially, even the sort of calling it a Chinese virus, and then all of the ways in which it's sort of been bound up with questions about borders and immigration, etc. So I think there are some ways in which that I think even that lens remains all too persistent.
Right, absolutely. I mean, the idea that a virus is an invasion from another country is really important to a kind of nationalist fantasy.
I mean, your essay is ultimately about the power of reading, about books, and I was delighted to see you end with Saramago and Blindness. And in fact, it is a novel that hadn't been on my consciousness, though it was one that I'd really sort of admired when I read it, and to bring that into the genre of plague literature as a sort of twist on that, I thought was really interesting. And could you say a little bit more about Blindness and what you took from that book?
Yeah, I think Blindness was, of all these books, the one I had never read before, and it knocked me down. I mean, back on my heels and like flat on my bum. Like, it was just brilliant piece of it. It was just really devastating, and it fully embraces the parable as the genre it's participating in. I recall none of the characters have names. We never really find out details about them. They're all figures. They don't talk to one another by names. They don't appear to know one another's names. It has a kind of quality of a medieval morality play to it as well, which I don't know, I just found very apt to the question of human suffering. I mean, there's a kind of stripped bare quality to the prose as well. It takes so much of what this literature offers, and it brings it to a really different place. It's also, I think it's from 1994, right? It's just got a much more familiar sensibility in terms of these questions of rule and the rulers and the ruled, and what the prospects are for living in dignity and equality and with justice, right? That animate, the urgency of our modern political dilemmas. They're also, I mean, I remember the very last thing I did before completely kind of quarantining here in Cambridge was I had agreed to give a talk at Rutgers with a former colleague of ours, Leah Price. And we decided not to cancel. It was sort of like iffy. So I went, and there was a dinner afterward. It's certainly the last dinner I went to.
Right.
And I had been reading the book on the train. I can't even believe that I took the train that day. And at dinner I said, I've just been reading this book blind. I said, almost everybody at the table, it was maybe, this now seems so shockingly decadent, it was maybe 12 people, but everybody had read it. Yeah. And people were sharing the scenes that they remembered most vividly. Yeah. And it really affected me, the sense of community you have with people who have read the same book. Yeah. And a number of people had the same scene in mind, which I had been struck by, but it kind of passed over because it didn't really fit my thesis. It didn't upend my thesis, but I was like, this isn't any use to me. But it's the scene where, so for the viewers who have never read this novel, and certainly should, the disease that sets upon this city is a highly contagious infection that makes you blind within a matter of hours from having contact with someone who's contagious. And what the government, which is kind of archetypal Latin American military rule, they decide to put all the infected into a lunatic asylum. They're just going to lock them up. They're going to quarantine them, and they barely feed them. I mean, it's mayhem inside the asylum. There's a bunch of blind people who cannot take care of themselves or one another. But a small group of people manage to get out well, they all get out at the end, but a small group of people who's led by a woman who can in fact see, manages to go back to the apartment of the ophthalmologist, who's our main character. And it's raining out, and they go out, the women all go out onto the balcony where they've collected water, and they have in the apartment one bar of soap, and none of these people have been able to wash for months and months and months, and they can't see each other, but they're filthy. And they stand on the balcony in the rain naked, and they pass the bar of soap around, and they clean. And everybody remembered that scene as cleansing, like as this moment where sort of like, this is like that is the step up from being an animal. I mean, like, you can use soap to clean yourself. You're not like licking your hands like like a feline. And everybody else is also out on the balcony. That anybody who's in any of the remaining buildings is standing in the rain, trying to get clean, trying to wash away the filth and the depravity and their own sins of the things they have done to one another, grasping at food, stealing food, beating people up. Like we can become clean again. We can begin again. And we were all kind of near weeping at the table, and we were having this kind of last supper.
Right. Yes.
It really, like, I got back that Saturday, and suddenly everything was shut down.
Everything stopped. Yes.
So I guess powerful. It really stuck with me about, what is the power of literature, right? It was that spirit of communion.
Yeah. And you see, as you point out in that final part of the essay, one of the most profound fear is of the loss of knowledge, and we're living through a time where that is juxtaposed with a sort of surplus of information and misinformation, and so much of our anxiety comes from the data, whether true or sometimes fabricated, that's circulating on social media and making us all worried. And I wonder how you would put those two things together, in a sense, sort of the loss of a deeper knowledge in relation to sort of a profusion, almost a sort of overabundance of information.
Yeah. It's interesting. I, like everyone else, spend an enormous amount of time watching the different graphs. Like, here's how Italy went, and here's how Iran is going. And I think the Washington Post had this interactive simulation where you could do different models, and the little people who were dots would move. It was kind of game theory based, like people would move around, or different simulations of the lifting of the lockdowns and what that would mean in terms of the spread. And we're all, in the thrall of a certain kind of simulation of the human condition that is data driven and algorithm driven, which is, as I would see it as a humanist, a big part of the problem of postmodernity in the first place, right? Like that we are in the thrall of algorithm-based knowledge is a huge diminishment. I mean, I think when I think, and this is where, my own kind of critique of the narrative of progress always takes me is, I understand we learn a lot through computer simulation of the spread of a virus and through computer simulation of environmental change, but I do not believe we actually learn from the computer simulation of human interaction and kindness and compassion and justice. And I just don't, I think there are, and this is my commitment kind of disciplinarily, right, that to try to model those things computationally is to forfeit our humanity. And so for me, the novel is just going to be a more compelling source of knowledge and of wisdom and of truth, ultimately, about these things. Like there's a lot that we can model quantitatively and computationally, but there are some things that I don't think we ought to be modeling because we have developed language. We have human languages, not computer languages, and we have literature, and we have art, and we have theater and forms of expression that tell us how humans survive scourges. And that's where I want to go to know.
Well, thank you so much, Jill, for joining us and for your thoughts. We really appreciate it.